On a moonless night in the spring of 1944, somewhere along the flat, ditch-cut farmland south of Rome, a young German soldier stood watch in a forward position and listened to nothing at all. He was part of one of the finest divisions in the German army, dug in along a narrow strip of reclaimed marshland called the Mussolini Canal, on the far right edge of a place the world would come to know as Anzio. He had been told to watch the dark. He had been told the enemy was out there, and for hours, the dark gave him nothing. No movement, no voices, no scrape of boots on stone, just the wind moving through the dead grass and the distant, occasional thump of artillery miles away. By every rule of war this soldier understood, that silence meant safety. An attack announces itself. Men cannot cross open ground in the dark without noise. Equipment rattles, someone trips, someone whispers. A line of soldiers moving toward you is one of the loudest things in the world, and a trained sentry learns to hear it long before he can see it. So when the night stayed quiet, the men along that canal allowed themselves to believe that nothing was coming. They were wrong. Something was already among them, and in the morning, when the grey light came up over the marshes, the survivors found their proof. A sentry dead in his hole with no sound ever raised, a machine gun position emptied, and on a helmet, or pinned to a tunic, or stuck to the wall of a dugout, a small printed card. On the card was a red arrowhead, and beneath it a short sentence in German. It read, "The worst is yet to come." The men who left those cards had come and gone in the night without being heard. They had walked into one of the most heavily defended lines in Italy, done their work, and walked back out. And the German soldiers facing them, professionals, veterans, brave men, began to whisper a name for the enemy they could not see and could not hear. They called them Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. This is the story of who those men actually were. Not the legend, the truth, which is stranger and in many ways more impressive than the legend. It is the story of how roughly 2,000 men, American and Canadian fighting together in the same squads, became the most feared raiding force on the Italian front. How they climbed a mountain the German command believed no army could climb. How they held a stretch of line meant for a full division. And how, across 251 days of combat, they never once failed a mission. If a story like this matters to you, a like genuinely helps it reach other people who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing, because we tell these stories the way they actually happened. To understand why the Germans were so unsettled, you have to understand what they were used to. The German army of the Second World War was, in many respects, the most tactically sophisticated military force on earth. Its soldiers were superbly trained. Its small unit doctrine was studied and admired even by its enemies. And on the Italian front in the winter of 1943 and into 1944, the Germans were not retreating in panic. They were conducting one of the most skilled defensive campaigns in military history, trading mountain for mountain, river for river, and making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of the road to Rome. These were not men who frightened easily. So when reports began to spread through the German divisions in Italy of an enemy that moved like smoke, that appeared inside prepared positions without warning, that killed silently and vanished before dawn, the reaction was not contempt. It was something closer to dread. One German division commander facing this enemy reportedly offered any of his soldiers a 10-day furlough, a precious thing in wartime, if the man could simply bring back one of the Black Devils alive. Whole sections of the German line pulled back, abandoning forward positions, to put distance between themselves and the patrols that came in the night. Soldiers stopped sleeping. They strained at every sound. And the silence, the same silence that had once meant safety, now meant the worst. That phrase from the card, "The worst is yet to come," became a kind of signature. The men who left it wanted the Germans to read it, to lie awake thinking about it, to feel watched. It was psychological warfare, deliberate and effective, and we will see later exactly where it came from and who designed it. But for now, hold on to the central mystery, because everything that follows is an answer to it. How did a single, relatively small unit terrify entire divisions of one of the best armies in the world? How did they get inside lines that should have been impossible to penetrate? And why, even after the Germans understood what they were facing, could they never find a way to stop it? The answer does not begin in Italy. It does not begin on any battlefield at all. It begins more than a year earlier, and thousands of miles away, in the snow-covered mountains of Montana, with one of the strangest military experiments of the entire war. And it begins with an idea so unusual that the soldier who would eventually command the unit first wrote a detailed report explaining why it would never work. In the early part of 1942, an eccentric English inventor named Geoffrey Pike brought a proposal to the British High Command. Pike was a civilian, a brilliant and unconventional thinker attached to the staff of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who led Britain's combined operations, the headquarters responsible for commando raids against occupied Europe. Pike's idea was bold to the point of recklessness. He proposed dropping a force of specially trained commandos into German-occupied Norway in the depth of winter. There, moving across the snow and ice in a fleet of purpose-built tracked vehicles, they would strike at the things the German war machine could not function without: hydroelectric plants, power stations, the industrial heart of the occupation. They would, in Pike's vision, immobilize huge numbers of German troops who would be forced to chase a handful of raiders across the frozen wilderness. The plan was given the code name Project Plough. It carried a special weight because one of the Norwegian targets was tied to German efforts in atomic research, the production of what was called heavy water, deep in the mountains at a place called Vemork. The concept reached the very top. Winston Churchill backed it. It was carried across the Atlantic and presented to the Americans, and General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, accepted it. A new tracked snow vehicle was developed for the mission by the Studebaker Company, a small, fast machine able to cross deep snow and soft ground, and it would become known as the Weasel. And the search began for the men who would crew it and the officer who would lead them. The beginning was anything but smooth. The first officer chosen to lead the new unit clashed badly with Geoffrey Pike and with the headquarters running the project, and he was removed before the unit truly took shape. He went on to form a famous American parachute regiment instead. The whole enterprise had an air of improvisation about it, a strange marriage of a civilian inventor's grand vision and the hard practical demands of building a fighting unit from nothing. It needed someone who could take the wild idea and turn it into trained men. It needed a builder. That officer was a 35-year-old American named Robert Tryon Frederick. Frederick was a staff officer, a quiet, intense, almost scholarly man who had joined the California National Guard as a teenager by lying about his age, gone on to West Point, and built a reputation as one of the sharpest analytical minds on the general staff. When Project Plough landed on his desk for assessment, Frederick did exactly what a good staff officer does. He studied it without sentiment, and he concluded that it was deeply flawed. He wrote a careful, detailed memorandum explaining that the plan, as drawn up, could not succeed. There were not enough aircraft to deliver the men and their vehicles into Norway. Worse, there was no realistic way to get them out again once the mission was done. The objectives were too ambitious for the number of men involved. On paper, Frederick argued, Project Plough was a recipe for sending good soldiers on a journey they would not return from. And here the story takes its first surprising turn. Frederick's report essentially killed the original Norwegian mission, but the senior commanders had read his analysis and reached an unexpected conclusion. The man who had so thoroughly dismantled the plan clearly understood the problem better than anyone else alive. So rather than thanking him and sending him back to his desk, they handed him the unit. Robert Frederick, the skeptic, was promoted and ordered to build and command the very force whose original mission he had just proven unworkable. He would spend the rest of the war turning that strange beginning into one of the most formidable fighting units the Allies ever produced. The unit was given a deliberately misleading name. It was called the 1st Special Service Force. The name was bland on purpose, chosen to sound like a rear area organization, perhaps an entertainment or morale outfit, so that enemy intelligence would have no reason to look closely. Behind that grey, forgettable label was something genuinely new. It would be a joint unit, built and manned by two nations at once. Most of its soldiers were American, with Canadians making up roughly a third of the whole. But the Canadians held about half of the officer positions, so that command was shared between the two nations from top to bottom. This was almost unheard of. Armies of different nations fought alongside one another, but they did not usually mix their soldiers together inside the same companies, the same platoons, the same squads. The 1st Special Service Force did exactly that. The arrangement was carefully worked out between the two governments. In the summer of 1942, Canada agreed to provide hundreds of officers and men for the project, around 697 in the original commitment. The Canadians would remain soldiers of the Canadian Army, paid by Canada and subject to Canadian discipline. But they would be fed, clothed, equipped, and housed by the United States Army, and they would serve shoulder to shoulder with Americans at every level. Command was split evenly between the two nations, from the regiments all the way down. An American might lead a company whose platoons were led by a Canadian and another American, with squads that mixed men from Winnipeg and men from Montana in the same foxholes. The whole force was organized into 3 small regiments and a service battalion, totaling only around 2,300 officers and men, tiny by the standards of the war. To keep the Canadian involvement quiet, the volunteers were assembled under cover names suggesting an ordinary parachute battalion. Then came the question of who, exactly, should fill the ranks. The mission they had originally been built for, fighting in deep snow, in mountains, behind enemy lines, demanded a particular kind of man. The recruiters did not go looking for parade ground soldiers. They went looking for men who already knew how to survive in hard country. Notices went up calling for single men, generally in their 20s and early 30s, who had worked as lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, trappers, game wardens, prospectors, and miners. They wanted men comfortable with explosives, comfortable on skis, comfortable spending nights outdoors in brutal cold. The idea was to start with men whose bodies and instincts were already shaped by the wilderness, and then build a soldier on top of that foundation. There is a popular story, helped along by Hollywood many years later, that the American portion of the force was scraped together from stockades and guardhouses, a unit of criminals and misfits. That makes for a good film, but it is not the truth. The reality was that the recruiters wanted hard, capable outdoorsmen, and that is mostly who they got. There was also a quiet challenge in those early months that no recruiting notice mentioned. Americans and Canadians arrived with different drill, different slang, different habits, even different ideas about discipline, and at first, they eyed one another warily. The shared ordeal of the training ground them together. Men who jump out of airplanes side by side, who freeze on the same mountainside, who carry the same impossible packs over the same endless marches, stop being Americans and Canadians after a while and become simply forcemen. By the time they shipped out, the seam between the two nations had all but disappeared, which was exactly the point. Among the men who came was a Canadian sergeant named Thomas George Prince. He was born in October of 1915 in Manitoba, a member of the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation and a descendant of a celebrated chief named Peguis. He had grown up an extraordinary marksman and tracker, a man who could move through wild country in near silence and read the land the way other people read a page. He had enlisted in the Canadian Army in 1940, volunteered for parachute training, and been selected for this new and secret force. Remember his name, because we will return to Tommy Prince again and again. What he did in Italy and France would make him one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history, and what happened to him after the war would say something painful and important about the country he served. But his story belongs later. For now, he is simply one volunteer among hundreds, standing in the Montana cold, about to be remade. The place they were remade was Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. The force was activated there on July 9, 1942. The location had been chosen with care. The wide, flat valley floor was good for parachute training, The mountains all around were good for skiing and climbing, and the isolation was good for keeping a secret. What happened at Fort Harrison over the following months was one of the most demanding training programs any soldiers in the war would undergo. It began almost immediately with parachute jumps. The camp had no jump towers, none of the gradual build-up that paratroopers elsewhere received. Many men made their first ever jump from an aircraft within their first days at the camp, hurled into the Montana sky with minimal preparation. The reasoning was deliberate. Sharing that fear early, surviving it together, forged the men into something tighter than an ordinary unit, almost from the first day. From there, the training only intensified. The days began before dawn, sometimes to the sound of bagpipes. The men learned demolitions until they could set charges in their sleep. They learned to handle not only their own weapons but captured German ones, so that they could fight with whatever they found in enemy hands. They ran forced marches over distances that broke ordinary men, one regiment reportedly covering a 60-mile course in around 20 hours. They learned to ski under the eyes of Norwegian instructors. They learned mountaineering, how to move on rock and ice, how to climb cliffs in the dark with ropes and without them, and they learned to kill at close range in a way few soldiers ever did. Their hand-to-hand instructor was a former policeman from Shanghai named Dermot O'Neill, a man with deep experience in the brutal close combat of that city's streets. He taught the men a fighting style with no rules and no mercy, designed to end an encounter in seconds. They studied human anatomy not to heal, but to understand where a man is most vulnerable. And they carried a weapon designed specifically for them, a long, slender, double-edged fighting knife known as the V-42 stiletto. Frederick himself had a hand in its design, working out a blade meant for silent work in the dark, with a sheath long enough to ride below a parka where a man could reach it fast. It was manufactured for the force by a knife company in the United States, and only the combat soldiers carried it. It would become one of the enduring symbols of the unit, and its shape survives in the insignia of elite units to this day. There was even meaning woven into the patches they wore. The force adopted as its branch symbol the crossed arrows once worn by the United States Army Indian Scouts, a deliberate nod to the kind of fighting they did, moving unseen, striking from the dark, living off the land. And as the training cycle ran its course, the force moved on from Montana, traveling east to train in amphibious landings and rubber boats on the Atlantic coast, learning to come ashore silently from the sea, just as they had learned to come down silently from the sky. By the time they were done, there was almost no way to move toward an enemy that these men had not practiced. They could parachute in, climb in, ski in, or paddle in. That breadth was rare in any army. This is the first layer of the answer to our mystery. The Black Devils could move silently and kill silently in the night, because that is precisely and specifically what they had been built to do, from the first week of training, with a thoroughness almost no other unit of the war could match. But training alone does not explain everything. There was something deeper at work, something in the way these men were knit together, and to see it clearly, we have to follow them out of the Montana snow and onto their first real battlefield, where the mission they had trained 18 months for was quietly taken away from them. The Norwegian operation never happened. By early 1943, the strategic picture had shifted, and the heavy water plant that had been one of Project Plow's targets was sabotaged by Norwegian resistance fighters in a separate and now famous raid. The grand vision of raiders crossing the Norwegian snows in their weasels evaporated. The force had been built for a mission that no longer existed, and for a time it seemed they might never see combat at all. They were sent instead to the far North Pacific, to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, where the Japanese had occupied the island of Kiska. In the middle of August 1943, the force landed on Kiska ready for a hard fight, only to discover that the Japanese garrison had already slipped away under cover of fog before the Allies arrived. There was no battle. The men crept forward expecting machine gun fire and found empty bunkers and abandoned positions. They had trained for over a year and met no enemy at all. It was a frustrating, almost absurd beginning. For men who had pushed themselves through the hardest training in either army, the anticlimax was bitter. But the experience was not entirely wasted. It had given them a real landing under field conditions and their first taste of operating as a complete force far from home, and it had hardened, rather than broken, their conviction that they were meant for something. The force had become, through all that training, an instrument of unusual quality, and the Allies needed exactly such an instrument in the place where the fighting in late 1943 was hardest. That place was Italy. The campaign up the Italian peninsula had bogged down against a series of German defensive lines anchored in the mountains. The terrain favored the defender absolutely. Steep peaks, narrow valleys, and prepared positions meant that a small number of determined German soldiers could hold up entire divisions. One of the most important of these mountain fortresses stood in the way of the road to Rome. It was a peak called Monte la Difensa. Monte la Difensa rose above the surrounding country, part of a mass of high ground that dominated a vital corridor toward Highway 6 and the route north. The Germans held its summit with a force of around 250 Panzer Grenadiers, dug into the rock, with more in reserve. The mountain had already broken better-known units. American infantry had attacked it through the autumn and been thrown back with heavy losses, and the offensive in that sector had been halted because the cost of taking the peak by conventional assault seemed too high to bear. The Germans had every reason to feel secure. They held the high ground. They had observation in every direction, and the most likely approaches were covered by interlocking fire. But there was one approach they did not cover, because they did not believe any army would be insane enough to use it. On one side, the mountain fell away in a steep, near-vertical face of rock, a cliff that climbed hundreds of feet. To attack up that face, in darkness, in winter, loaded with weapons and ammunition, was something no sane commander would order. And so the Germans left it lightly guarded. This was the gap, the unwatched door, and Robert Frederick saw it. He flew over the mountain himself in a small spotter aircraft, studying the ground, and concluded that the impossible face was exactly where his men should strike. The plan went to the force's 2nd Regiment, with a battalion led by a 28-year-old Canadian, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McWilliam, from New Brunswick, in the lead. Among the company commanders climbing that night was a young Canadian captain named Stan Waters, who would survive the war and go on, decades later, to become a general and a Canadian senator. The job of finding and roping a route up the cliff in the dark fell to men whose civilian lives had prepared them perfectly for it. 2 of the lead scouts were former prospectors and hard rock miners. One was an older American sergeant named Howard Van Osdale, part Native American and a former prospector, famous within the force for an almost supernatural feel for terrain. The other was a Canadian, Sergeant Tom Fenton. These were men who had spent their working lives reading rock faces and finding ways through country other people called impassable. Now they would do it under enemy guns. The campaign in those mountains was covered by some of the most famous war correspondents of the age, including the American writer Ernie Pyle, whose plain, humane reporting brought the ordinary soldier's war home to millions, and the photographer Robert Capa, whose images defined how the world would remember the fighting in Italy. The approach was its own ordeal. The men marched for hours through cold rain and deep mud toward the base of the mountain, then hid through the daylight hours in a cluster of trees, soaked and freezing, forbidden to move or make a sound. When darkness came, they began to climb. To cover the noise and pin the defenders in their holes, the Allies opened one of the heaviest artillery barrages the campaign had yet seen, more than 900 guns hammering the mountain mass and pouring tens of thousands of shells onto it. The shell fire was so enormous and the ammunition so costly that some of the men climbing in the dark looked up at the storm of fire on the peak above them and gave the mountain a grim nickname. They called it the $1 Million Mountain. Up they went, hand over hand, in the blackness and the cold. They free-climbed the worst of the face and used ropes anchored by the scouts for the rest, hauling themselves and their weapons up the rock a few feet at a time. It was the kind of climb that would be dangerous in daylight with no one shooting. They did it at night, in winter, expecting at any moment to be discovered. And against every expectation, they reached the top before dawn, without the Germans realizing they were there. The fight began when a sentry finally raised the alarm, but by then it was far too late for the defenders. The Black Devils were already on the summit, already among the rocks, attacking from the one direction the Germans had believed was safe. The shock of it was total. The defenders fought, but they had been outflanked by the terrain itself, and the position that had held against frontal assaults for weeks fell with stunning speed. Allied planners had estimated that taking the peak might require 2 or 3 days of hard fighting. The force took the summit in roughly 2 hours. That speed was bought at a price, and the price came afterward. Taking the peak was one thing, holding it was another. The men clung to the bowl-shaped top of the mountain, which they grimly called the Saucer, while the Germans poured mortar fire, rocket fire, and sniper fire onto them from neighboring high ground that had not yet been cleared. Much of that punishing fire came from a connected peak nearby that the British were still fighting to take, and until it fell, the force on the summit had no real cover from the German guns. The weather turned vicious, rain and sleet and snow and freezing cold, and the men had little shelter on the bare rock. They held anyway. They pushed on to clear the connected peak alongside them, fighting through the high ground for days, and they did not give up what they had taken. At last, they were relieved by an infantry regiment of another American division and came down off the mountain. The cost was heavy. Around 73 men had been killed, 9 were missing, more than 300 were wounded, and over 100 more had to be evacuated for exhaustion and exposure. Among the dead was Lieutenant Colonel McWilliam, the young Canadian who had led the assault battalion, killed by a mortar round on the mountain he had helped to take. Years later, the United States Army would name a building at its Special Forces home after him, so that his name would not be lost. A captured German officer, looking at the men who had come up the cliff, reportedly said that it was impossible, that no one could climb those rocks. But they had, and the United States Army's own official history would later judge that no ordinary unit, without this exact and unusual training, could have done what the force did on Monte la Defensa. This is the second layer of the answer. The Black Devils succeeded not only because they were trained to move and kill silently, but because they were trained as mountaineers and climbers capable of turning terrain that everyone else considered a barrier into a secret road. They attacked through doors the enemy did not know were doors. After Monte la Defensa, the force fought on through the brutal winter mountains, and then, in the late winter of 1944, it was sent to the place that would make its name immortal. The Allies had landed at Anzio, on the coast below Rome, hoping to outflank the German lines and break the deadlock. Instead, the beachhead had become a trap of its own kind, a shallow lodgment ringed by German forces on the high ground, under constant observation and constant shell fire, where the front line never seemed to move, and death could come from anywhere, at any time. Into this grinding siege the force was sent, arriving at the beginning of February 1944. They were given a sector on the far right of the beachhead, along that flat, exposed, ditch-laced farmland by the Mussolini Canal, taking over from ranger units that had been shattered in earlier fighting. The stretch of front they were handed was enormous. It ran for miles, a length of line that military doctrine would normally assign to a full infantry division of perhaps 15,000 men. The force had at this point only around 1,200 men available to hold it. By any conventional measure, the line was far too long and far too thin. A determined German attack at any point should have been able to punch straight through, and yet the force held that sector for 99 days without relief, and the Germans never broke it. The reason they never broke it is the heart of the legend, and it grew directly out of everything the force had been built to be. Frederick understood that a thin line could not be held by sitting still and waiting to be attacked, so he did the opposite. He ordered his men to dominate the night. Every night, patrols went out from the force's positions and crossed into the German side of the line. They cut wire, they scouted positions, they raided, they took prisoners, they killed, and they vanished. They did not wait for the Germans to come to them. They went into the German lines and made the darkness itself their weapon. The men blackened their faces, necks, and hands with boot polish so that nothing on them caught the faint light, and they moved through the night the way they had once moved through Montana forests, silently, patiently, deliberately. This is where the Black Devils were truly born, not as a story but as a daily reality. German soldiers along that front began to dread the dark in a way that ate at their discipline and their nerve. They never knew when the men with the blackened faces would come. They never heard them arrive. They woke to find sentries dead and comrades gone. And on the bodies, on the positions, on the walls of their dugouts, they found those small printed cards with the red arrowhead and the line in their own language, "The worst is yet to come." Frederick had ordered the cards made specifically for this purpose. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, designed to make a brave enemy feel hunted, to take away the safety of the rear, to make every German soldier in that sector feel that he was the prey and not the hunter. Entire German units pulled back from their forward positions simply to escape the patrols. The commander who offered a furlough for a single captured devil was admitting, without meaning to, that his men were afraid. One forward outpost run by the force became so notorious that the men gave it a name, calling it after the lieutenant who ran it, and war correspondents came out to write about it. They built it among the farm buildings out in the contested ground, and they named a street running through it after a German tank that rolled up to shell them at the same time most days, as if it were a neighbor with bad manners. There was a dark, defiant humor to it, the humor of men who had decided that the only way to live in such a place was to own the fear instead of being owned by it. They lived in holes in the ground, under shell fire, on a line that should not have been holdable, and they not only held it, they made the other side flinch. The patrols themselves grew bolder week by week. Small teams pushed deep past the German forward positions, hundreds of meters into ground the enemy thought was theirs, mapping gun positions and command posts, and then slipping back before light. The Germans tried to seal the gaps and could not, because the force did not attack in predictable places at predictable times. Every night was a different threat from a different direction. It was the same principle they had used on the mountain, refusing to come at the enemy where the enemy was ready, only now they did it again and again, night after night, for more than 3 months. The strain on the German troops facing them was immense. Men who cannot rest, who jump at every sound, who believe death can reach them in their sleep, do not fight at their best. The force had turned the long nights of Anzio into a weapon, and it never put that weapon down. And it is here, on the Anzio line, that we return to Tommy Prince. On the 8th of February 1944, near the town of Littoria, Prince took on a mission that shows exactly what kind of soldier the force produced. He ran a telephone wire from his own lines out to an abandoned farmhouse, a building that sat extraordinarily close to the German positions, roughly 200 meters from their guns, and some 1,400 meters of wire away from safety. From inside that farmhouse, hidden, he watched the German artillery positions and reported them back over the wire so that Allied guns could destroy them. He stayed for days, alone, deep in the danger zone. At one point, the wire was cut by shell fire, and the reports stopped. A normal soldier might have abandoned the position. Prince found, in the farmhouse, the clothes of an Italian farmer. He put them on. Then he walked out into the open, in full view of the Germans, posing as a peasant tending his land. He made his way along the line of the wire, pretending to weed his crops, and when he reached the break, he crouched as if to tie his bootlaces, and repaired it with his hands, while the Germans watched a harmless farmer go about his work. By some accounts, he even shook his fist at both sides, playing the part of an old man annoyed at the war happening on his fields. Then he walked back, resumed his hidden watch, and went on directing fire onto the German guns. For his courage on that line, Tommy Prince was awarded the military medal. His citation praised his complete disregard for his own safety and called him an inspiration to the men around him. Hold that image, because it is the entire force in miniature. A man trained to move unseen, thinking on his feet, improvising in the middle of enemy fire, taking a risk that should have been suicidal, and surviving it through nerve and skill. That was not luck. That was what these men were. So now we can see the deeper layers of why the Germans could not stop them. It was not one thing. It was the way the things stacked together. Most armies have a clear line between the men who plan and the men who carry out the plan. In the force, that line had been deliberately blurred. Every man had been trained to think, to improvise, to operate in small groups far from any officer's direct control, to make the kind of decisions in the dark that ordinary soldiers were never asked to make. A patrol of a handful of black devils, deep in German lines with no contact with headquarters, did not freeze when the situation changed. They adapted, because adapting alone in the dark was the thing they had been built to do, and there was the binational core of the unit, which the Germans never understood and never imagined. Americans and Canadians had been mixed together so completely, trained together so long, that they had become a single thing, with no seam for an enemy to exploit. They trusted one another absolutely. A man would go out into the night, knowing that the soldier on his flank, whether from Saskatchewan or from Texas, had been through every brutal day of that Montana training beside him and would not break. That trust, forged over a year and a half, was a weapon as real as the knife. There was also the psychological dimension, raised to the level of doctrine, the cards, the blackened faces, the silent killings, the deep patrols. All of it was aimed not just at killing Germans, but at unmaking their confidence. The force understood something that more conventional units did not. A soldier who is afraid all the time, who cannot sleep, who feels watched, who believes the enemy can reach him anywhere, is already half beaten before the fighting starts. The Black Devils made fear itself part of the battlefield, and they were very good at it. And above all of it stood Robert Frederick, the man who had once written a report explaining why this unit's mission could not work, and who had then built the unit into something the original plan never imagined. Frederick led from the front to a degree that astonished everyone around him. He went forward to where the fighting was, again and again, and he paid for it. Over the course of the war, he was wounded 8 separate times and received 8 Purple Hearts, among the most ever given to an American soldier. On a single day in the fight for Rome, he was hit 3 times. He was not a general who sent men into danger he would not share. His men knew it, and it bound them to him. An officer who bleeds beside his soldiers earns a kind of loyalty that no order can command. It is worth pausing to picture what one of those night actions actually demanded of the men, because the silence the Germans feared was not luck. It was craft. A raiding party would study the ground in daylight from cover, memorizing every fold and ditch. After dark, faces and hands blackened, weapons taped or padded so nothing rattled, they would move out in single file, the lead scout feeling the way, each man matching the pace of the man ahead. They moved slowly, sometimes covering only a short distance in an hour, freezing whenever a flare went up, melting flat against the earth. They had rehearsed what to do if discovered, who would fire, who would move, who would carry a wounded man back. When they struck fast and close, and then they were gone before the enemy could organize a response. There was nothing supernatural in it. There was only preparation taken to an extreme that few other soldiers in the war ever matched, repeated until it became second nature. By the late spring of 1944, the long siege of Anzio was finally about to break, and when it did, the force was at the front of the breakout. In late May, the beachhead erupted outward, and the Black Devils drove inland through the broken hill country toward the capital, fighting through the Lepini Heights and the towns that guarded the approaches to the city. It was vicious work against a German army trying to hold open its own line of retreat, and in that single week of fighting, the force lost a large part of its combat strength, more than 40 out of every hundreds of its fighting men, killed or wounded in the push toward Rome. And then, in the early hours of June 4, 1944, the force was given a special task. As the German army abandoned the city, there was a danger they would blow the bridges over the Tiber River, splitting Rome in two and turning the river into a battlefield in the heart of the ancient capital. Frederick was ordered to push into the city and seize the 6 bridges over the Tiber north of the Vatican intact, before the retreating Germans could destroy them, so that the city could be kept whole and the army could pour across without pause. A hand-picked patrol led by an officer named Captain Mark Radcliffe pushed into the city in the grey light of early morning. Radcliffe was a man who had already shown what the force was made of. Months earlier, at Anzio, he had been captured on a patrol, and while his captors moved him to the rear without bothering to blindfold him, he had calmly memorized every German position he passed. Then he had escaped, and made it back through the lines, carrying that intelligence in his head. Wounded and sent to a hospital near Naples, he had slipped away from his bed to rejoin the force rather than miss what was coming. Now he led his men through the streets of Rome, cutting the wires the Germans had rigged to demolish the bridges, securing the crossings one by one. The Black Devils were among the very first Allied soldiers to enter Rome from the south. Frederick himself was there, leading from a half-track as always, and was wounded yet again that day. Another of his regimental commanders, an American named Alfred Marshall, was killed in the fighting. By the end of the day, the bridges were held, and the city was saved from being torn apart along its river. The next morning, jubilant Romans filled the streets to greet the soldiers who had come for them, and just 2 days after that, far to the north, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, and Rome slipped from the headlines almost overnight. The force was not finished. In August of 1944, the Allies launched a second invasion of France, this time on the southern coast, and the Black Devils were given the job of opening the door. Off the coast lay 2 small islands, Port Cros and the Ile du Levant, whose German garrisons and coastal guns threatened the invasion beaches. In the dark, early hours before the main landings, the force came ashore on those islands in inflatable rubber boats, having sailed in from Corsica, using the same kind of silent, amphibious infiltration they had trained for years earlier on the Atlantic coast. They stormed the island defenses and worked to silence the guns that could have torn into the invasion fleet. On one of the islands, a stubborn German garrison held out in an old stone fortress, refusing to surrender until a British warship offshore battered the walls with its heavy guns. 9 forcemen were killed taking the islands. Then the unit came to the mainland and pushed up the French Riviera, town by town, toward the Italian border, fighting through Grasse and Villeneuve-Loubet and on toward Menton in the mountains above the sea. Frederick himself had by now been given a larger command, leading the airborne forces of the southern invasion, and he would go on before the war ended to command an entire infantry division and to become one of the youngest major generals in the United States Army. The skeptic who had written that the whole thing could not work had risen about as far and as fast as a soldier could. It was during this advance, in September of 1944, that Tommy Prince added to his legend a second time. He and a single comrade went out on foot, deep into the rugged country ahead of the Allied advance, covering somewhere between 70 and 80 kilometers over rough mountain terrain to locate German positions. On the way back, they came to the aid of French partisans fighting the Germans. For his courage and endurance on that mission, Prince was awarded the Silver Star by the United States. With that, he became one of only 3 Canadians in the entire war to hold both the British Military Medal and the American Silver Star, a level of recognition almost no one achieved. But the force itself was nearing its end. 2 years of the hardest fighting, the constant losses, and the difficulty of finding replacements who could meet its impossible standards had worn it down. The decision was made to disband the 1st Special Service Force. On December 5, 1944, in a field in southern France near Villeneuve-Loubet, the unit held its final formation. The Canadians paraded past the Americans in a last salute, and then they marched away to serve under their own flag once more. Many of the Canadians went on to a Canadian parachute battalion. The Americans were gathered into other units, with a large number forming the core of a new American infantry regiment that would go on to serve in Germany and on occupation duty in Norway, the very country where the whole improbable story had first been meant to begin. The 2 nations that had fought as one for 2.5 years went their separate ways. To this day, the Special Operations Forces of both the United States and Canada commemorate that parting every December in what they call Menton Day. So we arrive back where we began, with the German soldiers who could never solve the puzzle. They had faced an enemy that came in the night and could not be heard. that climbed cliffs no one was supposed to be able to climb, that held lines too long to hold, and raided deeper than anyone thought possible, and that left mocking little cards on the bodies of the dead. And even after the Germans understood the techniques, the blackened faces, the silent knives, the deep patrols, they could not produce an answer to them. You cannot simply order soldiers to become this. It took the strange origin, the unusual men, and the year and a half of merciless training, the binational trust, and the relentless leadership of a commander who bled beside his troops. The Germans had brave men and brilliant doctrine. What they did not have was a way to manufacture, on short notice, the thing the Black Devils were. When you measure what the force accomplished, the numbers are sobering. Across 251 days of combat, the 1st Special Service Force suffered casualties amounting to well over 100% of its authorized strength, because so many of its men were wounded, returned, and wounded again. By the official record enshrined later in American law, the force suffered more than 2,300 casualties, captured thousands of prisoners, earned battle honors from both nations, and never failed a mission. A unit of roughly 2,000 men had, in 2 years, carved out a record that far larger formations could not match. And here is the part that matters most about the legend. The part that is easy to lose under the boot polish and the printed cards. The Black Devils were not devils at all. They were lumberjacks and miners, forest rangers and farm boys, men from small towns in 2 countries who had been ordinary in 1941 and were extraordinary by 1944. What made them was not some dark magic. It was design. Someone had decided to take the right men, give them the hardest possible training, mix 2 nations into one brotherhood, and trust them to think and fight on their own in the dark. That decision built a unit so effective that the enemy reached for the language of the supernatural, because the ordinary language of war could not explain it. That is the real answer to the question this story began with. The Germans never heard them coming, not because the Black Devils were ghosts, but because they were the most carefully prepared raiders on the front, and preparation, taken far enough, can look like sorcery to the men on the receiving end of it. The worst is yet to come was not a boast about evil. It was a promise that these particular men, having been built for exactly this, would keep coming, and would not stop, and could not be reasoned with, or frightened off. And they kept that promise until the day they were disbanded. The legacy did not end with the unit. The 1st Special Service Force became the direct ancestor of the modern special forces of both nations. The lineage of the United States Army Special Forces, the soldiers the world came to know as the Green Berets, traces back to that activation in Montana in 1942. Canada's modern Special Operations Regiment claims the same heritage. The men of the force had worn a distinctive shoulder patch, a red spearhead with the word for the United States set across it one way, and the word for Canada set across it the other. 2 nations crossed into a single symbol. That spearhead shape, and the crossed arrows, and the silhouette of the fighting knife all found their way into the badges and insignia of the elite units that came after. The idea they proved, that a small force of superbly trained, deeply trusted, independently thinking soldiers could achieve things out of all proportion to its size, became one of the founding ideas of modern special operations. Every time a small team of highly trained soldiers slips quietly into the dark to do work no conventional unit could do, there is a thread that runs back to the men of the Black Devils. In 2013, the United States Congress voted to award the 1st Special Service Force its highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, recognizing at last the full measure of what those men had done. The medal was presented in 2015, more than 70 years after Monte la Defensa. A few years later, a replica of it was unveiled at the Canadian War Museum, and a small number of surviving veterans, very old men now, were there to see it. Among those still living to be honored were Jack Callowhill, Jim Summersides, and Ralph Mayville. They had been young men in the Montana snow once. They had lived to see their nations finally say, in the clearest possible terms, that they were not forgotten. But the most important story to end on is not a medal, it is Tommy Prince, and what the country he served did to him after the guns went quiet. Prince came home one of the most decorated soldiers Canada had produced, a man who had been received by the king himself, who wore the medals of 2 nations on his chest, and his own country denied him the rights it gave freely to other veterans. As an Indigenous man, he was not treated as a full citizen. He struggled to access the benefits other soldiers received. He could not find a foothold in the peace. He re-enlisted and fought again in Korea, serving with a famous Canadian regiment and taking part in hard fighting in the hills there in the early 1950s, including the defense that became one of his regiment's proudest battles. But the old wounds and the hard years caught up with his body, the knees worn out by jumping and climbing and marching, the strain of 2 wars settling into him. And then his life came slowly apart. He suffered the deep, unhealed injuries of the mind that war leaves behind, the kind we now understand far better than his generation was allowed to. He fell into poverty. At his lowest, he sold the war medals he had earned with such courage in order to survive. He spent his last years in a hostel, and he died in Winnipeg in November of 1977, far from the heights of Monte la Defensa and the farmhouse on the Anzio line. But the story does not quite end in that hostel, and it should not. When Tommy Prince was buried, the man whose country had failed him in life was honored in death by an extraordinary gathering. His own First Nation was there, the government of Canada was there, and so were representatives of France, of Italy, and of the United States, 3 nations whose soil he had helped to free, sending their respects to a single Ojibwe soldier in Manitoba. In the years since, Canada has tried, slowly and imperfectly, to give Tommy Prince the place in its memory that it denied him in his lifetime, naming streets and barracks and a day of recognition after him, and telling his story to children who were not yet born when he walked out of that farmhouse dressed as a peasant under the German guns. The medals he had been forced to sell were tracked down and bought back by a member of his own family and placed in a museum in his home province, brought home at last so that what he earned could be seen and honored where it belonged. That is where these stories always seem to lead in the end, back to a single human being, not to a legend, not to a nickname whispered in fear across a dark Italian field, but to a young man from a small place who was asked to do impossible things and did them, and then had to live out the rest of an ordinary, difficult life, carrying what the war had given him and taken from him. The Black Devils were made of men like that, on both sides of a border, men who climbed the mountain and held the line and went home to a world that did not always know what to do with them. Thank you for spending this time with these men. If their story reached you, the single best thing you can do is leave a like, because it helps this history find other people who will care about it. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good moment to do it, so the next story finds you too. And I would like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. And if there was someone in your own family who served in the Second World War, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up hearing, tell me about them. Most of those men said very little about what they did. Telling their names here, now, is one small way of making sure that what they gave is not forgotten.